Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on smart proteins, innovative technologies at the forefront of food. My name is Deva, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. First is a market research and consultancy firm operating in India for over a decade and provides food and beverage consultancy services along with industry platforms such as events, conferences, and academic outreach program. We are a business associate of Giract, which is a global market research and consultancy organization in food and beverage ingredients, additives, and related fine chemicals, and has about 50 years of experience in this field. First, in association with Giract, is running an R&D and NPD accelerator program to address R&D requirements which are not fulfilled in-house. In this regard, FIRST invites expert speakers from the industry that benefits both the industry and the academic world from such shared knowledge. I'm pleased to introduce the speaker for the day, Mr. Varun Deshpande. Varun serves as Managing Director at the Good Food Institute, where he's focused on building the future of food by working with scientists, foundations, governments, entrepreneurs, and corporations to advance the alternative protein sector. He spent several formative years studying chemical and biomedical engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. He then went on to work on implementing digital health in India and the United States, helping vulnerable populations through care coordination and a systems approach to healthcare. Varun is a leader in the effective altruism movement, which seeks to investigate and target the world's most pressing problems. In dedicating his work to the future of food and combining his duty to human and planetary health, Varun aims to build a more healthy, sustainable, and just global food system, particularly across the developing world. First facilitates food companies to tap the solutions from the Indian academia and young minds. We help innovative companies solve challenges in the science, technology, and business by connecting them with an extensive network of Indian academia. First team members are all highly qualified food scientists and technologists with substantial commercial experience. We invite food, beverage, and food ingredient companies to discuss and avail the R&D acceleration collaborative innovative services. The handout for today's webinar is available in PDF format and is downloadable for your reference. If you're not able to download for any reason, please drop a message in the chat window and I will send it to you. All participants are muted to prevent background noise. You can post your questions in the chat window during the webinar and we will try to address during the Q&A session. However, a recorded version of this webinar along with the Q&A responses will be sent to you via email in a few days. Feel free to follow our official LinkedIn page where you can interact with experts and also discuss post questions related to the industry. You will also be updated on the latest trends in the industry and market research studies published by FIRST. The link is available in the chat window on your screen. Without any further delay, I'd like to welcome Varun to begin the session. Over to you, Varun.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deva. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Please go ahead.
Great. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Deva. Thank you to the entire team at FIRST for organizing this wonderful webinar. My name is Varun Deshpande. As Deva said, I'm the Managing Director at the Good Food Institute India, and I'm here today to talk to you about a very exciting, innovative sector that's currently at the forefront of food innovation called smart protein or alternative protein. Just a quick introduction to the Good Food Institute. We're a global network of non-profit organizations in India, the US, Brazil, Israel, Europe, and East Asia, primarily out of Singapore and Hong Kong for now. And we focus on the science, business, and policy of the alternative protein sector. So you can think of us as a kind of think and do tank, an accelerator, a consultancy, a policy advocacy group, strategic advisory group, all of them rolled into one. But before we go into the alternative protein sector, let's think a little bit about the question that underpins it, the reason that we're even doing any of the work that we're doing overall. And that is the question of how we're going to feed 10 billion people, or nearly 10 billion people, by the year 2050, 1/6 of whom will live in India, over 50% of whom live in Asia, and do it through systems which do not negatively impact global health, climate change, biodiversity, scarce natural resources, etc., etc. And this is something that is incredibly important because, as you can see on your screen here, the demands for feeding 10 billion people are vastly different from the demands of half a century ago or even 15 years ago. I also want to underline that this question, as we all know on the webinar today, many of you are food industry professionals, some of you might be public health professionals. It is a particularly important question in the context of India because we have this demographic dividend, an incredibly young population. As of this year, I believe the youngest population in the world with a median age of about 29 years old. But that demographic dividend is both an opportunity as well as a challenge that we must face, because we do have some of the highest cohort rates of public health challenges, malnutrition, etc., anywhere in the world. Iron deficiency anemia, neural tube defects, other debilitating conditions arising from micronutrient and macronutrient deficiencies, which really affect our populations, our young population's ability to shape their own destiny. We also do have, as you know very well, a very large cohort of farmers and their families, something like 50+% of our entire population, which is just an unfathomably large number. It's hundreds of millions of people that are reliant on agriculture and that do face tremendous challenges, as we're seeing currently with the political scenario as well. And then finally, this is a particularly important time to be having this conversation in the context of the global pandemic. Earlier this year, and even in some parts today, we saw what were essentially pandemic refugees, people that were unable to go from their workplaces in the cities to their homes through regular transport and other things because of disruptions in services. And so you saw people, this photo is mostly men and they look like able-bodied men, but you saw pregnant women, young children, people walking hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers across state borders back to their villages and their homes. And this is what the future might look like in a world that suffers from increasing climate crises and public health crises. So we come back to the question of how we're going to feed 10 billion people in the context of all of this. And when you examine that question, one of the major things that comes up as a challenge to it in terms of the resource burden and the environmental impacts, etc., is what you see on your screen here. It's protein, more specifically meat, or to put it a little more broadly, animal sourced foods in general. Unfortunately, when it comes to our protein supply, if we're thinking about feeding the world sustainably, efficiently, and safely, we do have some challenges in that regard. We can't really continue with business as usual. So if you look at any of these areas, if you look at, for example, sustainability, a number of reports, tons of agencies, the UN FAO, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Eat Lancet Commission, a lot of people have come out and said that in order to be able to feed 10 billion people by 2050, we're going to have to look at industrialized animal agriculture or factory farming and think about rethinking that entire system, because it is one of the top 2 or 3 most significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues. So if we care about ocean dead zones, ocean acidification, deforestation, greenhouse gas emissions, any number of these issues that relate to the environment and climate change, then this is an area that we must think about. In fact, industrialized animal agriculture causes more climate change than all emissions from the entire transportation sector combined. That's all planes, trains, cars on the earth combined. Now, I mean, why are we using all of these resources? Why are we using 75% of agricultural land to raise and feed livestock, but only getting 1/3 of the global protein supply from it? It's very simple. It's because we eat animals who eat plants. So if you look at a chicken, for example, it takes in 9 calories of input for every 1 calorie of output it gives you in the form of flesh or meat. And this is quite an intuitive result, right? Because as you and I are sitting here and I'm speaking, you're listening to me, we're both burning calories. We're both, living organisms. So it makes sense. We're sitting around, a chicken is sitting around growing feathers, growing beak, growing pieces that we perhaps don't eat, right? And so we're expending a large number of calories to feed them in the form of crops like corn, soy, and wheat in order to get meager returns. And actually, we've pushed these animals to their biological limits, and we're going to be unable to actually get much better than this. And this, I think, is good to remember in the context of India, because we think about food waste and the issue of food waste. something like 40% of food, 30 to 40% of food is wasted globally. In some places, it's because of pure food waste that reaches the plate and is wasted. In other places, it's because of things like post-harvest losses, etc. But thinking about 9 calories in versus 1 calorie out, that's 8 calories wasted versus the 1 calorie you got out of it. So that's 800% food waste. And as I said, we can't actually get much better than this. And chickens are in fact the most efficient animal that is widely farmed for meat. There are other animals that are much worse. Cows and pigs are worse. Fish, depending on the fish, are worse. Not only that, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of safety, there are some challenges that are presented by this system. So um, we're actually feeding 70 to 80% of all antimicrobial agents, antibiotics, to farm animals and not even to humans, right? So it's a system that is a breeding ground for superbugs. It's a system that has caused the former head of the World Health Organization to say we're heading towards a world in which antibiotics may not work and common infections might once again kill, which would be the end of modern medicine as we know it. So these are all issues that we absolutely have to think about. And of course, in light of COVID-19, I don't think it's lost on anyone that zoonotic diseases are also under the microscope increasingly over time. Now, of course, because I've said all of this stuff, everyone here and everyone in the world is going to stop eating meat. And so we will be safe because we won't need to create all of those issues anymore, right? I can hear you shaking your head at home, right? So that's obviously not true. People aren't going to stop eating meat just because we tell them all of these things. In fact, demand for meat is expected to go up, outpacing population growth by 2050. So we're expected to require about 50 to 70% more meat by the year 2050 in order to feed those 10 billion people. And in fact, much of that growth is going to be driven in places like India, Southeast Asia, China, Sub-Saharan Africa over time, Latin America, places where income is continuing to rise, right? So this picture shows you that India is the hottest zone, or South Asia is the hottest zone for the growth in poultry demand, and the picture is similar for other types of meat and eggs and dairy, etc. So all of that being said, the Good Food Institute India and the Good Food Institute's approach globally is to focus not on the problems, but to think about how we can offer solutions to producers and to consumers that taste the same or better and cost the same or less over time, so that it feels like a simple switch. It doesn't feel like a sacrifice. So we focus on taking current meat, egg, and dairy production, and we look at essentially providing alternatives that feel like that simple switch. And this is where alternative proteins come in. These are really exciting, almost revolutionary new technologies and product types that have been improving rapidly over the last few years and decades, and they fit into 3 categories primarily. There are plant-based proteins, there's cultivated meat, and then there's fermentation-derived proteins. Jumping right into it, plant-based meats, of course, they fit into a broader category of plant-based foods or plant-based proteins, but I'll just zoom into plant-based meats right now. They're produced using plant or crop ingredients like pea protein, coconut oil, beetroot juice, of course, soy protein, etc., etc. But they are focused on replicating the sensory and the cultural experience of eating animal meat. So if you look at some of the products that are out there on the market, you must recognize some of these. So if you look at plant-based burgers that are doing extremely well globally currently, these grew out of the US because the US currently eats 3 beef burgers a week on average per person, which is a ridiculous number if you think about it from a public health and a environmental standpoint, right? This kind of production of beef burgers is exactly why cows are some of the worst emitters of greenhouse gases in the world, because we just produce so many of them. So if you took all the cows around the world that are farmed for milk and for meat, and they made their own country, they would be the 3rd largest emitter of greenhouse gases anywhere in the world. So a lot of this innovation having come up out of the US and Europe and places like that, the earliest products on the market have these burgers that are kind of restructured products. So they are minced meats that are formed into sausages or burgers. But you're also seeing on the right there that you're seeing more kind of structured extruded type whole muscle products that look like muscle fibers, right? What's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, is that a lot of the impact here is being felt because these products are going far beyond the previous generation of soy nuggets or things that have existed for a while. So these are not really mock meats. The reason that they're called plant-based meats is because they've gone several steps beyond that, and they're focused very much on meat eaters. So some of the leaders in the space, like Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, 90+% of their consumers are actually non-vegetarians. So if you look at that, that could fall into the general devoted omnivore or devoted carnivore category, or it could fall into this interesting group called flexitarians, who are aware of all the things that I'm telling you about right now and are actively trying to reduce their meat consumption, but they still retain their taste for meat. And of course, this particular slide is based on the US population to illustrate the point about impossible foods and beyond meat. There, the vegetarian and the vegan population is quite low. In India, that corresponding number is about 30% of the population is vegetarian, uh, if you count eggs as non-vegetarian, right? So I think the proportions would be different in India, but the intention would be the same. Now, I think there's a question generally about the cost of some of these products. So I did want to highlight also, I pulled some data from the US. Some of these products are already getting down to price parity in at least in conventional retail, if not in wholesale. There might be some ways away in wholesale. Important to remember, of course, that we are at the very beginning of this industry. So it'll take some time and it'll take more and more scale. But we're seeing really high repeat purchases, drivers for repurchasing, despite the cost and ability to pay a premium for it. And over time, of course, that will become more rational. And if you look at some of the growth here, what's really heartening is it's not just startups. Of course, these startups now have also scaled to billions of dollars in valuation, hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, but it's also the pre-existing largest meat and food and beverage companies in the world that are taking a look at this. So obviously Tyson Foods being, and you all know Godrej Tyson in India, but Tyson Foods being the second largest meat producer in the world, JBS being the largest meat producer in the world, all of these companies are taking a look at this and saying it's an opportunity for diversification, it's an opportunity to meet their sustainability goals, and it really is the leading edge of innovation in the space. So 9 out of the top 10 US meat producers at the end of last year had either invested in or started their own line of plant-based meats. And then, of course, as we discussed earlier, the pandemic is making this an even more accelerated path to market for a lot of these, or accelerated path to scale, I should say, for a lot of these products. Whereas the slaughterhouses and the meat packing facilities in places like the US, Europe, Australia, etc., have become COVID-19 amplification points just because of the conditions of how they are operated, etc. We're also seeing the growth in emerging markets. Really interesting that places like China are taking off very quickly, and we believe that this will happen in a place like India as well over time. It might take a couple of years for it to reach the same point, but we think that there's a huge opportunity here as well. And that's where you get these kinds of numbers, right? So if you look at any of the projections on plant-based meats, you're looking at a very large percent of the meat market predicted to be comprised of plant-based meats in the near future. I mean, over the next 5-10 years. So we're talking a market size of $85 billion by 2030, anywhere up to $370 billion, depending on the projection you look at. So just to dive a little bit into the science here, talk about plant-based meats a little bit. The core goal of plant-based meat is to think like an animal protein, right? It's to take a plant protein that is in a globular form and to turn it into something that resembles the animal interdigitated fibrillar tissue, fibrous tissue. And you look at the image on the bottom right there, that's what I showed you earlier as well, of the types of products that are now coming on the market. That image on the bottom right is very, very close to chicken meat. And here's the interesting piece, and this is where I think a lot of people on the call today, and in general, your colleagues and your contacts would come into play. There's a huge opportunity, despite all the growth that we've seen in this space, to make fundamental improvements that give consumers products taste the same or better and cost the same or less. We're talking juiciness or moisture, flavor, texture. The opportunities to get involved are really massive. Across this value chain, there are opportunities to optimize, because all the equipment, all the ingredients, all the crops, all the processes, all the distribution mechanisms even were optimized for different industries a very long time ago. So if you take it right from the crop selection, where you could optimize for increased protein content in the source crop like pulses or millets, you could create interesting blends of ingredients, let's say with the pulse and a millet, because millets are not very high protein, but pulses can be made higher protein, oilseeds can be higher protein. And you could get essentially micronutrient and macronutrient complete blends that do have the best amino acid profile that you want, don't have as much limiting amino acids that plant proteins are known for. You can optimize across the processing piece, right? So currently the the gold standard process to make these whole muscle products, the ones that you're seeing on the right there in terms of texturization, are things like high moisture extrusion. But there aren't that many twin screw extruders, the machines that you need for high moisture extrusion. They don't really exist a lot, especially in a country like India. There isn't that infrastructure yet. So can we pioneer really interesting new techniques, or can we do some frugal innovation on how to get that moving? That would be really interesting. And this is where I think all of you come in, and as I said, all your colleagues, your network comes in. We need people across this entire sphere. So as I said earlier, meat companies, animal sciences, chemical engineering, cell biology, bioprocess, a lot of these folks are needed to be able to make products that are superior in the future. As a couple of examples, I'll just say, there's a company called Eat Just Inc. that makes the Just egg. They make it from mung beans. It's a San Francisco-based company that makes eggs from mung beans and some other plant-based ingredients. So it's 100% plant-based. The mung bean, as we all know, has been cultivated in India for about 4,000 years, right? May have been even first domesticated in India. And what's really interesting is because this egg is made not through conventional means from plants, it uses vastly less water and land, emits vastly less CO2. And they've already sold about 65 million egg equivalents in the market. If they scale according to their projections within the next 2, 3, 4 years, they'll be the largest private buyer of mung beans anywhere in the world. So the opportunity to integrate backwards into the agri supply chain in a place like India is also very large. And you might have also seen that there are some companies on the ground in India that are being inspired by this approach and also making plant-based eggs from mung beans and other ingredients, but this company is the pioneer of that. Another company, which I mentioned earlier, is Beyond Meat. The Beyond Burger is so sustainable that if you replace 1 out of those 3 beef burgers every Americans are eating per week, it would be the equivalent of taking 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million additional homes. And this company went public on the New York Stock Exchange last year, and it's one of the most successful IPOs in decades of any kind. Okay, moving on from plant-based meats, we've just spent a lot of time on plant-based meats. I'm going to breeze through some of the other production types of the other categories of alternative proteins before we get to the Q&A. And my apologies, I don't know why there's a parade out the window right now, but those are the sounds of Mumbai. So thinking about cultivated meat, which is the second category that I was referring to. Cultivated meat is a very interesting newer category that is basically taking cells from an animal and farming them outside the body of the animal instead of farming the entire animal and slaughtering it. So it's almost like cutting out the middle animal, so to speak, and the result that you get is 100% biologically meat. So if you were allergic to a specific type of shellfish, you could perhaps eat the plant-based version that wouldn't contain any of those cells, but you could eat the cultivated version because it would be cultivated shellfish, the same shellfish biologically. And then additionally, we're also thinking about how this might look at scale, because up until this point, people have been focusing on the early piece of this. So you would need the cells to culture. So you need chicken cells, or you need bluefin tuna cells, or salmon cells, or pomfret cells, Bombay duck cells, these different types of meats that you're trying to make. And interestingly enough, you could optimize that, right? You could get the best, you could get a Kadaknath chicken or a specific heritage type of meat, which you would also optimize for certain scientific parameters, of course. You grow them inside, or you feed them cell culture media, which is just the nutrients that they eat inside the body. So you just give them those outside the body of the animal, and those consist of salts, sugar, amino acids, different types of things, proteins called signaling molecules that tell cells to grow or tell them to differentiate into bone tissue or muscle tissue, different types of things. And then you let them grow, and they usually grow inside a container called a cultivator or bioreactor. And those look very similar to like a beer brewery or an industrial yogurt production scale system. And then finally, in the final product, you have a heterogeneity like meat, right? So in meat, you see, let's say you look at a fish fillet, you have fat and you have muscle and you have connective tissue. There are different types of cells that are in final animal tissue. So that's what you would want in the end product. Now, just talking very quickly about the timelines here. In 2013, Professor Mark Post was the first person to produce a cultivated meat burger. He ate lamb burger live on TV. He cooked it and ate it live on TV. And the research project had been funded by the Dutch government, the Netherlands government, to the tune of $330,000. So of course the press said, oh, this is a $330,000 burger. That's not true. That's not how much the burger cost. But just for illustrative purposes, let's say it was, right? Today, this person has a company of his own. It's called Meats. So 7 years later, they've just announced the close of a $75 million round of funding. And they have an internal cost basis of producing these burgers or similar burgers of about $10 to $12. So that is what is that, a 3,000-fold reduction in cost, which is really exciting. Similarly, we've seen multiple other companies that were formed. The one on the top there, or actually in the middle, both images in the middle, are from a company called Memphis Meats, which was founded by an Indian American cardiologist named Dr. Uma Vati. Memphis Meats was actually the first company incorporated in this space, taking on from the inspiration of Dr. Mark Post's research project. And they've raised about $186 million earlier this year as well. So, the pandemic hasn't really slowed down funding for this space because it is seen as a way to get ourselves out of future pandemics. And we're seeing about 65 plus companies now globally that are focused in this exciting new area. And up until a couple of weeks ago, I would have told you that this is actually not cleared for to be served anywhere in the world yet. But that's not true anymore, because last week or a couple of weeks ago, the Singapore government, the Singapore Food Agency, announced that they are authorizing the sale of cultivated meat for the first time anywhere in the world, which is really exciting. So, we worked with the Singapore government for a very long time, about 3 years, to go through rigorous safety protocols and to communicate with consumers and think through how they might want to regulate this and what kind of safety tests, etc., they want to set in place. And we're very happy with the result in terms of how rigorous it is. And they've really gone ahead with meshing the best of different regulatory regimes around the world. And it's an example of what's possible, because Singapore is thinking about this area as a great opportunity for them from a food security standpoint. They currently import 90+%, 92% of their food from abroad, and they would like to reduce that to 70% within the next 10 years. So they're seeing alternative proteins, particularly cultivated meat, as a major opportunity for them to do that. Okay, and finally, the third category type is fermentation. So fermentation is a well-known protocol within the food industry in general, but within this area of alternative proteins, we mean either the cultivation of any microbial species for its whole biomass, so either growing fungi or microalgae or other microorganisms to eat them directly, or to use them as a production platform for something else. And this, of course, has been done many, many times in other parts of the food industry, right? So we produce enzymes that are used in food using microorganisms a lot. We use microorganisms to produce rennet, which is used in the maturation of pretty much all the cheese we eat. We use them to produce chymosin. We use them to produce amino acids for things like animal feed. And we use them in a variety of different ways. But what we're talking about here, as I said, is we grow the fungi or the microalgae or other microorganisms, and we use them either as a whole biomass standalone protein source on the left there, or we use them as ingredients or enablers, enzymes, valuable things like amino acids, etc., etc. And just laying it out a little bit differently, these are the different types of fermentation that we might be talking about. So on the bottom right there, you see traditional fermentation, which is alcoholic beverages, beer, you see yogurt, you see tempeh, these different kinds of things. On the left, there's whole biomass fermentation, which we'll talk about. And then on the top, there's precision fermentation, which we will also talk about, that are used in the alternative protein space. Here's an example of traditional fermentation being used in the alternative protein space. A great company in the US called Mycotechnology. They've raised, again, I think over $100 million now. And they use traditional fermentation using shiitake mushrooms and other types of agents. They use those to ferment plant proteins and give you a superior taste profile, etc., for use in meat replacement products. And they actually are being used in JBS, the largest meat company in the world's plant-based line, on the bottom right there. You also have these whole biomass applications, as I mentioned, which is really interesting. You look at the images here. Look at the images. Look at the image on the left. I would not be convinced that this is not an actual steak or red meat. You look at that chicken breast, it looks fantastic. You look at the bacon. So these are the kinds of innovations that we need, because, as I said earlier, you need to be able to give consumers products that taste the same or better and cost the same or less eventually. And then finally, here's another example of precision fermentation. So many companies doing different things. The company on the left there, Clara Foods, makes egg white proteins using microbes as a production platform. company in the second from left, Perfect Day. Again, they've raised $360 million in total. By the way, they are also run by a couple of Indian founders. They make beta-lactoglobulin made from microorganisms. So it's the protein that's found in cow's milk, but it's made without the cow. There's Geltor, which makes collagen proteins. There's heme proteins. There's growth factors. There's all sorts of other applications as well. And finally, what we think will happen is you'll see different production platforms being used in different ways. And we get a more healthy, sustainable, and just global food system because all of these production platforms you can monitor much more safely. They eliminate the risk of antibiotic use. They eliminate the risk of zoonotic diseases. And they're able to give us or catalyze an affordable, tasty, sustainable supply of proteins over time. And that's what we'd like to do. So just really quickly wrapping up my presentation here, these are the various, this is a snapshot of the various projects that we run in India. As I said, we work across business, science, and policy. We had a summit in October where we had 2,300 plus people come. Indra Nui, the former chairperson and CEO of PepsiCo, was one of the keynote speakers. Josh Tetrick, the founder of Eat Just Inc., the company I was mentioning earlier that makes eggs from mung beans, and which, by the way, is also the company that received permission from Singapore to serve their cultivated meat product, their separate cultivated meat product in Singapore, was also one of the keynotes. And we had, I believe, about 53 speakers across 38 sessions that were just talking about innovation in this space and really inspiring the audience. We've also run a smart protein innovation challenge this year, which has been really exciting, which I'll talk about presently. We're trying to roll out coursework at universities, etc. Sorry, this is a little more about the Smart Protein Summit. I'll just move on. The Innovation Challenge was geared towards getting young people thinking about our space, especially in a year when their colleges were on pause and life was on pause a little bit. Our focus was to help them think through, if you're a chemical engineer or a food scientist or an industrial engineer, mechanical engineer, a computer scientist, a lawyer, whatever it may be, how can you get involved in an innovative new sector that helps you align your values with your career? And we had a lot of great partners for this at the bottom there. We got about 1,084 students to go through our innovation challenge early on. They went through dozens of hours and assessments of our materials. We are currently on Saturday, next Saturday, we will have, or this Saturday on the 12th, we'll have our final round. So 1,084 people have come down to about 10 teams now, and we're going to choose 5 winners. And some of them will end up forming companies and entrepreneurial ventures, but our goal was to get them to really think about an exciting new area so that they can become viable candidates to enter the space as employees, as entrepreneurs, etc. We'll also be launching university courses in India, we hope pretty soon. And if you have ties to universities in India, we'd love to do that. The GFI India team has helped to teach university courses in Israel over the last year and next year, and in the US as well. And this is, an example of, we already have all of these materials. We're in conversation with multiple universities, and we would love to work with you and yours as well. And then we also have a global grant funding program, which is a competitive grant funding program. We work with donors who give us a grant purse, and then we identify the high impact areas that could go out as a RFP, right? So we'll be launching the next version of this, I believe, in February 2021. And we'd love to work with anyone that's interested in applying to this. And even if it doesn't work out for this thing, we would love to take that as an opportunity to build a relationship with you and apply to other grants that might exist elsewhere. And lastly, just to close, we've done this before. We've transcended a primitive technology, which is animals, in other industries, right? In the early part of the of the last century and the end of the 1800s, the end of the 19th century, there were a lot of debates in places like New York City. There was an entire economy built up around horses, and there was even a type of job which was cleaning horse poop off the streets, right? There were entire city planning conferences that were set up with major topic on their agenda being, how do we deal with all the horse poop, all the horse manure on the streets? And then Henry Ford figured out how to scale the automobile, and that went away, right? And not only that, it added a lot of productivity to the economy, created a ton of jobs, etc. And we think that's what we can do here. The difference, of course, being that in this sector, we would be aligned with sustainability from the word go. And in a place like India, that's extremely important. Just as we've leapfrogged landlines in many parts of the country, we could do the same here, right? We're still growing in our meat consumption, our animal meat consumption. I think we need everyone to come together, whether you're an animal meat company or a government agency or a university or any other type, a food industry veteran or a student, a young person, whatever it is. I think we all need to come together and think about this in terms of a mission to leapfrog industrial animal agriculture and its harms, a mission for smart protein over the next decade, because this really is the critical decade in terms of building a more healthy, sustainable, and just food system. Thank you. You can get in touch with me, through Giract or by emailing us at india@gfi.org. I've really enjoyed doing this presentation, so thank you so much to everyone for being here today.
Thank you so much, Varun. Not just the title being a smart protein, the presentation as such was also very smart and insightful presentation. Thank you once again for that. I'm sure it was very useful to all our listeners. Let's now quickly move on to the Q&A session. We've received few questions during the registration and also during the live webinar now. I've collated some of the similar questions, and here's the first one. What are the difficulties one can face as a plant protein vendor?
Yeah, so that's a very interesting question. I think it really depends on, where in the value chain you are. So if you are, in fact, in the very early part of the value chain, if you're in the protein extraction and protein concentration and isolation business, then I think one of the things that might be important to note is that up until a very few years ago, people were thinking about that side of things more as a supplement or a nutraceuticals area. And the parameters there are a little bit different because the consumer there is a little more forgiving, right? So a consumer who's drinking protein shakes might not have as strict a requirement on taste as someone who's just buying a regular food product, a center of plate food product, as we might call it. So I think it's important to note that if you're in that side of things, you have to look at taking a food science approach, functionalizing plant proteins, bringing blends into it, really understanding what your customers and their customers want, right? Because your customers might be end product food formulators who are making plant-based products, either meat, milk, eggs, or other types of plant-based bars, etc. And they really have a customer that will be more unforgiving on taste and perhaps even on price. So all of that stuff is really important to remember. I think the same thing goes through the value chain. So if you're making extrudates or other types of processed ingredients, slightly more processed ingredients than just the isolates, you really have to remember what the market wants. And these are all obvious insights, but in terms of the functionality that we're talking about, you have to test for things like protein dispersibility index, emulsification, foaming, gelation, stability, all of the things that dictate how these products function or how these ingredients function in the end products. Right? Those are the things that I would look at.
So the next question is the protein industry dwelling over dairy versus plant or dairy and plant?
Yeah, so this is an interesting area that people have looked at even within the meat space. So there are some products that are out there that are blended products of animal meat and plant-based ingredients, and I think that has its place on the shelf. But the way that consumers are going over time, there'll definitely be more and more of a reduction in animal protein consumption overall. But I think in the interim, for the next 5, 10, maybe even beyond years, it does make sense to look at, I think, blended products and things like that. I think that's an interesting area for sure, because you could add in more nutrients, right? And from a consumer standpoint, there is a halo effect associated with that. So, you might be able to fortify. I mean, this kind of already happens if you think about it. Like fortification with certain nutrients is technically, if that nutrient is a plant-based ingredient, is already the addition of plant to dairy or plant to meat. And I think that already happens to a certain extent.
Okay, here's the next one. So India is predominantly known as a vegetarian country worldwide. So how do you think India is reacting to this plant-based meat, and what pace do you think it is moving? And also another question similar to it is, how has been your experience with the food companies in India so far in terms of reception and interest in this field?
Yeah, both great questions. I'll take the first one first, obviously. So I think one thing to note is that the view of India as a primarily vegetarian country is wrong, right? So we do have 71% of our population self-identifies as non-vegetarian, including eggs, which does indicate that perhaps the strictures of religion, right, that strict, we are not going to eat any animal sourced food because, I mean, any meat or eggs, let's say, because it is non-vegetarian, is not as big as we thought. In fact, the constraint seems to be more income rather than religion or other strictures. Obviously, 29% of the population is still the largest vegetarian subsection of any population anywhere in the world. That's what, 300, 400 million people. That's a huge number, but we are definitely less vegetarian as a country than one might assume coming in, right? And that's borne out by all the projections as well as real market data, as I was saying, in terms of meat consumption as well. So if you talk to any of the people that actually set up industrial poultry processing facilities, the ones that do have all the challenges that I was mentioning earlier of public health, etc., they will tell you that they're seeing 25% year-on-year growth in demand in the country of India over the next decade. And that kind of tracks with the FAO slide showing India as the reddest, hottest zone that I mentioned earlier as well. As far as what the perception or the reception has been, what's interesting is India seems to have the same early adopter cohort, that flexitarian cohort that exists everywhere in the world, right? So roughly 30 to 50 million people living in the tier 1 and tier 2 cities, generally younger, generally could even be more disposable income. So they could be double income, no kid type people. And they are consuming like their global counterparts. They're eating like their counterparts in Sydney, London, New York, Singapore, etc. And they know what's going on in the space. So they're seeking out some of these products. I think the principal question for the industry, and this is true across any sort of food innovation or any sort of even FMCG innovation, right? Like new shampoos and new different types of packaged foods, etc. Can it scale from beyond that early adopter upper end of the market to the entire mass market? Because then we're talking hundreds of millions of families, and that's when we're talking about the billion plus people that we actually should be able to target in a place like India. And I think that question is purely satisfied on the basis of taste and price, as I mentioned earlier. And this is true. This is true for shampoos. It's true for general food. It's true for smart protein as well. So initially, you might see these products, plant-based meats, plant-based eggs, etc., consumed by people in Mumbai and Pune and Delhi and other places like that who already care about some of these problems and who are making choices on the basis of these problems. But over time, if we can get those products to taste the same or better and cost the same or less, and we can help them get the distribution they need, so they're available everywhere, that people already want to consume meat, eggs, and dairy, then you'll see a lot more people switch over. And on that last point, just addressing the food companies in India. So the packaged food companies, the food manufacturers in India are definitely interested in the space, but they might perhaps be waiting for entrepreneurs to step in first and test the market a little bit more. What we've seen is almost the food services economy, so the manufacturing piece, the ingredients piece, and the QSR or the distribution piece. These people are definitely way more risk taking and able to enter this space. So we've seen, for example, we worked with ADM India to set up a partnership between them and Imagine Meats, which is Ritesh and Janelia Deshmukh. We were advising both of these parties on how to get into the space in India. So we put them together, and now they formed a partnership to bring products to market, right? So you'll see people like Ritesh and Janelia getting involved. It'll make the space more fashionable, more sexy, if you'll excuse my use of that word. And then you'll see more and more people getting involved. Equally, we've been in touch with all the QSRs because their global counterparts, oftentimes these companies are multinationals, right? So their global counterparts are serving all of these products and are hugely benefiting from those partnerships with the international plant-based meat companies. So we're seeing equal interest in India, but I think it will take some time. As I said, it might take a couple of years before we have a thriving ecosystem, but we're certainly working in that direction.
That was a clear explanation to those two brilliant questions. And moving on to the next one, what is current trend in the food and beverage industry during the COVID times as food processing industry and services are facing crunch?
Oh yeah, I mean, COVID-19, I'll speak specifically for the smart protein sector, right? Because I think that's my specific area of expertise, but I might offer a couple of other comments as well. our industry of our sub-industry of alternative protein or smart protein, we were expecting many product launches on the market this year, right? So we have been working with about 30 entrepreneurs in India, and many of them, I would say 20, 25 of them have become serious or have even launched their companies within the last 18 months. So we were expecting many of them to launch on the market this year, maybe 10 launches across different categories, which would be quite interesting, right? Especially if one of them is, let's say, Imagine Meats, Ritesh and Janelia Deshmukh, and a lot of these other types of people that are coming in. You'll see a lot of noise about it. But unfortunately, because of COVID-19, that was pushed. Now we think much of it will happen next year, or some of them have started happening towards the end of the year. The reason for this is very simple, right? Stuff you might expect. The labs are closed or the kitchens are closed, so they can't actually continue developing their product or getting it ready for market. Logistics is a problem, so bringing ingredients or experts into the country from abroad is a problem. Processing, manufacturing facilities are closed, universities are closed. So, all of these things present issues, and they've delayed the industry a little bit by, I would argue about 9 to 12 months, which is basically, we can think of COVID-19, at least 2020, the year of 2020 as like a blank year in terms of market launches. But I will say, one of the things that I would like to say here is that there are other fundamental infrastructure issues that might be as important, if not more important, specifically in this industry, right? We're talking about the lack of fundamental equipment and infrastructure at university level and in the market. So I was talking about extrusion earlier. I've been having the same conversation about extrusion for 3 years. There isn't a twin screw extruder that has been available for entrepreneurs to experiment with anywhere in the country, right? There are some larger companies that have them, but they're not able to help entrepreneurs, use them. There are universities that have them, but they're lying broken or something. So you have to pay to repair it if you want to use it as an entrepreneur. It's not a viable option, right? So these are the things that we're working on, getting government to invest in it more, get the universities endowed with these equipments, get university courses moving. I think these are the fundamental problems that we have to resolve, COVID-19 or not. And this exists in our space. It also exists across the food sector generally.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Do we, Varun? Can I go ahead with one more question if that's okay for
Yeah,
you?
yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So, according to you, what will be the world's foremost plant or alternative proteins in the next 5 years?
So, I mean, what's really interesting right now is fermentation as a production platform that sits between plant-based and cultivated meat. So we believe in all of these categories, and we think that, for example, indigenous crops, indigenous plants like pulses and millets and hemp, all of these really interesting ones have not been utilized sufficiently, and we're definitely doing a lot of work to unlock a lot of the scientific information I mentioned earlier on these crops, so that you get superior ingredients using pulses, millets. The founder of Eat Just, Tetrick, says that there's been a plant-based egg hiding inside the mung bean for 4,000 years because it has that perfect mix of amino acids and that functionality in combination with other ingredients, which gives you that egg-like fluffiness and gelling and all of that, which you wouldn't have known unless you were examining all of these crops. So we're very bullish about all of these different things, but I will say that fermentation has emerged very rapidly because these microorganisms, they do have, as I showed you in the pictures before, they have that inherent fibrous structure if you grow them correctly, and they're incredibly nutritious by default. They grow incredibly efficiently, right? So you only need a little starter culture of a fungi to be able to grow really delicious, wonderful products. And some of these companies, it's really interesting. Across all, cultivated meat as well as fermentation derived proteins, they're actually doing experiments on growing these in space. So on the International Space Station, in such a resource constrained environment, can we grow meat? Can we produce meat? And if we're able to do something like that, you can imagine what the promise is in India or in other places around the world where we really need the protein, right? We have a population that absolutely needs proteins made in delicious ways that people actually want to eat. So I think we're bullish across all categories, but maybe fermentation might be a really interesting area moving forward.
Thank you, Varun, for answering all these questions. We've received a lot of many more interesting questions, but in the interest of time, we are wrapping up the session now. As mentioned already, the recording of this webinar, along with answers to all the queries received, will be sent to you via email in a few days. Thank you all for your active participation. Please take a minute of your time and answer the survey questions which you will receive after this webinar. This will help us plan our future webinars. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful weekend. Stay safe and keep smiling. Bye.
Thank you, Deva. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.